big crowd tonight, but that's okay. Tonight is pretty straightforward, but it's some important pieces, especially this time of year, because now we know what worked, what didn't work, what we want to change, what can we do to change things to make things work for us. But first I'm going to talk about fall garden cleanup. And even though primarily I'm going to talk about vegetable gardens, I still have some information about like perennial beds, annual beds, things like that. So we'll talk about composting all that debris from your garden too, because it can be a lot, a whole lot. And when I talk about that and composting and mulching your beds, it's in no way to say I don't support like leaving the leaves program, things like that. I mean, it's a valid thing to leave the leaves, but it's also a valid thing to take your leaves, chop them up, and use them as a mulch as well. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then, of course, how to get ready for next spring. We're not really thinking about spring right now. We're still trying to enjoy the last little bit of summer, but if we want to do new beds for next spring, I have a super easy way to do it. You probably heard of it. It's called lasagna gardening. It's layering, tarping. It's got a bunch of different names, but it's one of the easiest ways to establish a new bed without really putting a ton of like hard labor into it. It's a pretty neat thing to do. And we're going to talk about soil amendments. And just in case, I did bring soil test boxes with me. Help yourself to as many as you would like. I recommend doing a soil test before going to all the expense and the trouble of doing soil amendments. And also we'll talk about cover crops and applying manure. That's a pretty common practice. We'll talk real quick about caring for your tools. And I don't usually talk about that because I figure everyone has their own method. But I have noticed that the cost of tools has really risen, and the quality of tools has risen as well. So now that we have some quality garden tools, we might want to, know how to maintain them too. And I'm going to talk about notes from your garden. And what if it's the opposite? What if you want to downsize? What if you're like, it was too much, it's too big, I can't maintain it, or I grew way too much food, which we'll talk about what if you grew too much food. And when we talk about methods of preserving your harvested food and what to do with that overabundance of the harvest. Does anybody have any questions or topics that they want me to cover tonight? Yeah? Okay. We'll just jump right in then. Maybe. I'm doing something wrong.
Is it?
I broke it already.
Maybe the batteries are dead?
It worked earlier. I tested it.
Oh.
I can use my... No, this isn't working either. Maybe...
Oh, it's just completely frozen.
Yeah, maybe... There we go. We're moving now.
I went too far.
Okay.
Oh. There you go.
Alright, so just go ahead and put... Alright.
It just froze for a minute.
Oh. Kind of like me. Okay. So first off though, let's talk about season extension. It seems like pretty much now what happens is we get one early frost, and it's not truly early, but like say September. It's not a heavy killing frost, but it's enough to damage. So what we want to talk about is, because we probably have, lots of tomatoes, we still have probably some greens and things, and we don't want them to get damaged by the frost. So this photo is suspended row cover, and a brand name of it is like UMaine, floating row cover. It gets a few different names, but the good thing about this is that it can this floating row cover can raise the temperature underneath that additional 10 degrees each day. So as we get into those cooler days, if you have the row cover on, you can maintain a growing environment that's closer to, say, 2 to 3 weeks ago, because you're raising the temperature underneath the floating row cover. This does not have to be suspended like a hoop house with hoops or anything. This can lay directly on the plants. But if you're going to get a frost, and it's going to be that light frost that we just need to get by so we can get that extra month of growing, you can go out and put this on. Now, there are different weights to it. You know, some of it is super thick, and that's more for like early spring, but there's a lighter version like this that also helps with insects and keeping the insects out, and it can help some with weed suppression as well. What also works besides UMaine and Agribond is old sheets and towels. If you know you're going to get a frost, and like I said, it's going to be just that one time, and then we won't get another frost for 2 or 3 weeks, and you want to save like your tomatoes or whatnot, go ahead and just cover them up. This is not going to damage them, other than perhaps if you got rain. I've had it get heavy before and maybe break a few branches, but that method works just as well as, you know, the Agribond or the UMaine. But having said that, beware of putting a clear plastic on there, because if you put the clear plastic on and then you don't get it off in the morning or the next day quickly, that's conducting that heat, and that's going to damage your plants. That's a little too much for them. It would be like the solarization I've talked about before, where you put clear plastic down on an area you want to kill all the weeds on, and it just cooks it. And so just be careful if you have to use a clear plastic. So again, the row cover can enhance the growth, you know, by raising that air temperature up to about 10 degrees. It does insulate, and it does keep residual heat overnight, you know, to some extent. So say you had the row cover over the top and you had a black plastic mulch down as well. That's quite a bit of heat you're generating there, because that will radiate from the bottom and keep the air space above warmer. As I said, they do have different, I call them mills, like a plastic, but they do have some woven row covers that will give you frost protection down to 28 degrees, which is pretty good. If you think about it, that's darn good. Now, of course, your coal frames, like I talked about, you know, when it's suspended over the rows, that works even better, because that does, it's like, that almost creates like a passive solar kind of environment. Does anybody use row cover at all? No. So I started using it 3 years ago, and it was expensive in my opinion, but it worked wonders. And it also helped that if I didn't have a chance to get out there, I didn't have to worry about it. You know, I didn't have to worry about heavy sheets or something weighing everything down, because, you know, it would dry quickly. You know, the wind would come up and it would dry. So I think it was worth it for sure, but then again, I was not doing like a huge field or anything like that. So this is maybe what you're starting to see in your gardens. We're starting to look at maybe end of season kind of appearance here. This is some squash. It's just like, okay, we're almost done growing here. But cleanup, especially when it comes to vegetable gardens, super, super, super important. So it doesn't apply just to the vegetation in your garden. You're going to want to take everything out. Don't leave any of your tools or even the debris. Like for instance, the reason I put debris on here is because some folks will like do pole beans, so they'll cut tree limbs, and they'll put those up, and of course they're covered with twine, usually held together with twine. And we want to be careful about what we're leaving behind on those. because we don't want any pathogens or anything to carry forward next year and give us the same problems we had this year if we had any. Now, I put plastic mulch on here with a grain of salt because the goal, at least from my point of view, with the plastic mulch is to get it to last as many seasons as you can effectively. It is costly. It is, one of those things that the green industry is trying to deal with as far as like if it is a plastic mulch. We have a recycling area at our office that greenhouses and farms can bring their plastic mulch to be recycled because it can be a lot. And what do you do with it? If you have the real heavy stuff and you put it out for your trash pickup, they're probably not going to take it. So even though it's recommended to leave the plastic mulch down, clean up every year, I'll admit I'm on year 3 of one of my plastic mulches, and it's done really well except for turkeys. The turkeys have damaged it. Excuse me. And so, long story short, with the plastic mulch, I'm trying to leave it as long as I can and get as much life out of it. But I know there's 2 problems going on with it. Number 1, I have a rodent problem under there a lot of times. The field mice love going under there. And second problem is the minute it gets a hole in it, grass and whatnot will sprout up from it. And something as innocent as a turkey walking across, they can puncture a hole in that, and then next thing I know, I've got quackgrass growing up. So, excuse me again, you'll have to play it by ear. The recommendation is take everything out of the garden, such as the landscape fabric as well. But I use landscape fabric in my rows for weed suppression, so I do not take that up every year. But I also figure it's in a row for walking. It's not like I'm growing plants in it, so I'm not as worried about pathogens and leaving things behind. But things like stakes and trellises, if possible, take them out. Clean them and then store them for the following year. But mostly, especially, remove the dead plants after the killing frost. A killing frost, sometimes it's hard to know if it was truly like a hard frost, but once you get a hard frost, then you know. And you're like, yep, that one did it. Now we only want to compost those dead plants, the plant material, only if it's disease free. So not all of funguses and pathogens and whatnot will survive over winter, but the rule of thumb to be safe, if it's diseased, don't compost it. Diseased plant material we want to dispose of in another way. Because if you think about it, that compost, once we put it in the compost, eventually we're going to bring it back out and put it back in the garden. Things could overwinter. So I just talked about pathogens, but also insects. We don't know what insects we're transferring to a nice home in the compost pile where it's going to be nice and warm and cozy for them. Because it's not just the beneficial insects that I'm going to talk about that overwinter in plant material. I like to make myself feel good, like, I'm going to leave some of my stalks and my flowers up so that the insects, the beneficial insects, can overwinter in there. And that is a good thing, and I recommend that. But I also need to consider that the not so beneficial insects are going to do the same in the things I put in the compost pile. Also, if you remove all of the vegetation at the end of the season that's been killed by a frost, it will help you manage your problems for next year. You're not going to transfer it. You're not going to create a circle. But as I said, for perennials and flowers, we can leave the tall, sturdy stems, and like leaf cutter bees, things like that will nest in there. Well, they'll lay their eggs in there and whatnot. And of course, songbirds are going to feed on the seed heads of like coneflowers and things like that. So with the perennials, flowers, you can leave more. You're not going to worry as much about a disease problem. But you'll notice in a lot of our bulletins, a lot of times our first recommendation is sanitation, which means remove all that plant debris. So it's a catch-22, I guess. But like the coneflowers here, you know, you they can be left and be beneficial, and I don't think that they're unattractive in the winter landscape. But I also like my gardens to be tidy, so I strike a balance. So things in the front that I see every day tend to get cleaned more thoroughly than the others. But so fall cleanup continued. So what are we going to do with that plant debris? Because I just said, you know, you can't compost this, and you're going to have a lot because you're going to remove everything out of the vegetable garden. Well, I suggest maybe building a new compost pile. You can compost pile, just, you know, piling up organic matter that's going to be decomposed by the fungi, the bacteria, you know, any of those organisms. But it also is an opportunity to recycle your kitchen and yard and garden waste as well. When you add kitchen scraps to your compost pile, though, always make sure you cover them, because otherwise you'll get critters. You're going to attract critters to that. The other thing is, if you plan on recycling all your kitchen waste, but your compost pile is way out by your garden, just keep that in mind as well. I mean, if it's not going to be handy, it's not something you're going to do. Just like with the watering. When watering is a challenge in your garden and you have to go through a lot to do it, it's probably not going to happen. But the reason I bring this up is because I see a lot of small composting tools, and people put them right by their kitchen, and the only thing going in there is kitchen scraps, and again, it's going to attract critters. So just be mindful of that, because we want a good combination of carbon materials and nitrogen materials. So if we're only adding kitchen scraps, we're going to be high on the nitrogen and low on the carbon end. But if you create a new compost pile, you're going to have a product that's going to improve the soil, and you can turn that back around hopefully next year, and add it back into the garden. So how do we go about that? With a compost pile, we're looking at 2 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen usually. And it's very forgiving. It does not have to be exact, but you'll know when you put like a half a bale of straw, you know, in your compost pile, you can see pretty clearly, you know, how much you're going to have to balance that out with green material. So for fresh garden waste, like that picture I showed you of the squash, it's going to be a big volume. Sometimes if you've got too much volume, it's better to chop and make it smaller, and also make it a little more uniform, because it's going to decompose faster, which is a good thing. It's kind of like canning. When you chop your vegetables, you try to make them uniform in size so that they'll all cook at the same rate. Same thing with our compost. We want it to cook all at the same rate, and if they're roughly the same size, they will. But things like grass clippings are good to add, but I will caution you that you shouldn't use grass clippings from like a sprayed lawn, something like that, something with a lot of chemicals. Again, with the kitchen straps and scraps, be sure to cover them whenever you add them. And when I'm talking about kitchen scraps, it can be fruits, vegetable peels, coffee grounds, eggshells. it should not contain things like meats and bones, animal waste, as far as like your pets. And don't forget to water. The pile should be kind of like a wrung out sponge. And a lot of times, especially when I'm adding in the fall, when I'm cleaning out all that garden waste, I'll put a big pile in and I'll give it a squirt with the hose because I want that water to penetrate at every layer. And I am adding a large amount all at once. In a perfect world, I would add a little bit this time, a little bit that time, you know, and it would be very even. But the water is necessary because the microorganisms that are breaking down that compost need water as well as oxygen too. Any questions so far? Okay. It's pretty straightforward, and I'm sure you all have had experience with composting on one level or another. Again, no fats or dairy products, meats or bones. We don't want to put the diseased plant material in there, and I ought to clarify that. Sometimes when I'm picking up plant material from the garden, don't really think about it, but like if I'm pulling the bean plants, for example, there's still beans on there. And if I had a problem with my beans this year, I'm transferring those beans into the compost pile. Or same thing with tomatoes. You know, if I'm putting tomatoes in there, I might be putting those, you know, tomatoes that had late blight or early blight or whatever. So I want to be cautious and not put those into this compost pile. Now, also weeds that have gone to seed, that's a tough one. Because it seems like right now, those annual weeds have just millions of seeds. And so it's like, what am I going to do with them? I got to get them out of the garden before they spread all those seeds. And normally, I would say yes, weeds, you know, can be, weed seeds can be composted and be managed. But when it comes to a home compost situation, we're not going to reach those high temperatures like, say, a commercial process, or even some home gardeners, you know, are able to achieve those higher temperatures. But like at 150, you know, for the average home manure compost pile, you're just going to be transferring those seeds. You're going to give them a nice home for the winter, and then you're going to be putting them right back into the soil come spring when you spread that back out. So try not to be adding all your weeds into your compost pile. You can have a separate pile for them, and you can try controlling them with something like solarization, but don't put them into the thing that you have designated to go back and enrich your soil. So I talked about your pet waste not going in there. So of course, dog, cat, or pig manure, and that's because they have parasites that just won't compost down. You know, like the roundworms, scarids. They just, it's not worth the risk for sure. Plus, I wonder if that would just encourage your pets to then use your compost pile as their new place. They might be like, oh, this is where they want me to go. So, roughly 3 by 3 for the compost to break down uniformly. But that's if you're going to get fancy and make a bin. When you do make a bin, if that's the route you choose to go with, remember you've got to turn it. So you need a way to get in there and pitchfork it or whatever if you're going with the 3 by 3. So sometimes you think, oh, I'll be able to get the front of that off pretty easy, but once you start having all that compost go in there and it's pressing against what you've designated as your entrance, you might run into a little bit of a problem with that. I like piles. I just like a loose pile. It's so much easier to access from all directions, so I find it gets piled up easier, flatter, I guess is what I want to say. Like, I'm not having to choose just one direction that I'm putting compost into. So to me, loose is a good way to go. I will show you a picture in a minute, though, of a really cool compost bin. And yeah, I wouldn't mind having it, but I also know that I wouldn't be able to get in there and turn everything, and I wouldn't be able to pull in from the edges, which we'll need to do. can take you several months to a year for it to all break down. You can tell it's all broken down when it's dark and crumbly and you don't recognize what's in there. If you can still look in there and say, oh, look, there's my tomato plants, it's not done yet. You need to give it some more time. And as I said, it needs water and oxygen as well. So that's why we have to turn the pile and bring those edges in so it's evenly composting. When you get done your product, though, when you have your compost done, you can create kind of a screen to filter out all the bigger pieces that didn't get composted. Just take even some fencing, something like that, and put a frame around it, and you can just fork it over, and what is small enough will fall to the bottom, and the larger pieces you can send back for another round of composting. So when you have your finished product, it's going to be dark and crumbly, and it's going to be something you really recognize as a rich organic matter, and you're going to want to put it back into your garden. But you can also add some to your potting mix if you would like. You can top dress your lawns with it. That's a great way to top dress your lawns, and by top dressing, I just mean a light layer over the top, and then those nutrients will go back into your lawn. You can also use it as a mulch, and I think it makes a really, really good mulch under trees and shrubs, because it's going to suppress the weeds, but yet it's going to work into the soil, provide nutrients, and I think it's just I feel just as good about doing that as I do about leaving leaves and things under the trees. As far as it being a place for a soft landing for like caterpillars and things, I think it's a pretty soft landing for sure. So these are the fancy composting bins. This one on the end, this actually slides up and down in this, but I got to I think of it like as a tailgate, and you can slide that out, and then you can get in there and pitchfork it like the top picture. Problem being, when I have enough debris against this, I can't lift it up. It's not clear in the picture here, but this is wire, so you're getting oxygen going through. The organisms can go back and forth in between. Water could go back and forth in between.
Is it wire on the back too?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and this is kind of just the frame. But what I do like about this really well is like this section, the first section, I could designate that as like September compost, so I would remember, and then this would be October. So I wouldn't have to worry as much about things being done at the same time. Or I could say, this is going to be all tomato debris, or this is, even though I'm still mixing my browns and my greens, so my carbons and my nitrogen, I could kind of keep track a little better than just that big pile that I like. Now this is the one I like, this picture here. So this is a pile. Now they do have a tarp over it. Your compost pile can be in shade or in sun. Shade is fine too. It's just going to work a little slower. I think what they're doing in this picture is trying for weed suppression, because it is a happy place for weeds to come and grow. And I also think that they put some wire over it to keep critters out, because I can see a lot of food debris down here, like maybe kitchen waste. So, but I just find it easier to access for me. But that's not to say it wouldn't be nice to have that neat and tidy 3x3 design that I showed you before. So let's see. I can't see what time it is. How am I doing on time?
It's like 6:30 right now.
Oh, okay,
Yep.
Thank you. So what to do with your excess harvest? And there is a reason that I'm talking about this now, because if you're like me, you have probably still 70% green tomatoes. And you're still in hopes that things are going to work out well, and they always do, and that's fine. But also, we've gotten some rain recently. So my cucumbers have gone crazy. So I have a lot of excess right now. Now, of course, the easiest thing to do with a lot of things is going to be freezing. And a lot of times when things are hectic in the garden, it's easier to, like, if you have your berries and things, freeze them now, can them later this winter when you want to heat up the kitchen. But you can do water bath canning for your acid foods like jams and jellies, relishes, pickles. And I always think of relishes, not quite this time of year, but in a couple of weeks, because it seems to me like relishes are always this kind of hodgepodge of like some onions and some, all these different ingredients, which you may not have a huge amount of, so you throw them all together and make a relish, and it's great. But, of course, there's pressure canning, we've still got time for carrots, beans, corn, meats. Some tomatoes you need to pressure can, or you can pressure can. Then, of course, you've got the option of dehydrating and fermenting. Root cellaring is still an option, but just keep in mind that different vegetables need different humidity, different temperatures to store well. And then, of course, you can consider donating some of your harvest to a local food pantry. But I would ask that you please contact them ahead of time. Make sure they have the capacity to take it before you just deliver it. So, because they really, really have to plan for those things, because they have to distribute it, and they have tons of things to do, as you know. Anything you want to say on that, on recommendations? No? Okay.
Yeah, just check it.
I think they just got a big donation today.
Yeah.
Of cucumbers, maybe, something like that.
I think that everyone's cucumbers are taking off right now, because it's been so dry. And most of us finally got some rain, and the cucumber is like, yay, I'm going to live, and it's producing like mad, so.
Is it just the new or modern hybrids that are considered low acid? Are the heirloom tomatoes, do they have enough acid that you can just water bath?
No.
Okay.
This is the problem with tomatoes now, is that they are so borderline. They can be a 4.6, and actually, depending on their ripeness level, they can have a pH all the way up to like 5.2. So now we have to acidify all tomatoes, unfortunately, by lemon juice or acid, or you can do vinegar, but some people find the taste offsetting. So you can add a little sugar, but then it's like, okay, I'm adding sugar to offset the vinegar, and then, so. But the lemon juice, I don't personally ever notice when I add the lemon juice by volume. I mean, it's not that much. But I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because I'm going to skip ahead. One of the reasons why we don't ever want to can tomatoes from frost-killed vines, because that raises the pH on them as well, quite a bit. And as I mentioned, if they're overripe, but also like even some of the pathogens like early blight, late blight, one of the issues with that is that it's going to increase the pH, and we don't know where it's at. We can't even be sure. It could, like I said, it could go all the way up to like a 5.2. So even if we're not seeing any damage to the fruit itself, it could still be there, and we don't know it. Just like with mold spores and things, we can't see, if they've gone down in. So that's one of the reasons why this ties in, your excess harvest ties in back to season extension with preparing for frost, because a lot of us still have a lot, to do with our harvesting. But if we know a frost is coming, we know we can't, manage what we're about to harvest, it is a good time to contact your local food pantry and say, hey, I have way more. Can I share with you all? So it all unfortunately can come together in a perfect storm sometimes, and it never fails every year. Even though I have frost alerts on my phone, and all of this, and it comes up on the local weather, last minute I'm out there, when it's dark 30, I'm out there covering everything up, trying to save it and all of that. So, for the food preservation pieces, if you have any questions on that, check our webpage for sure. So as I said, disease-free tomatoes for preserving, preferably vine ripened. Now I put that in there on purpose because I wanted a good laugh. Because I just told you all, the frost is coming, and you're gonna, probably out there a lot of times, besides covering, you're probably going to harvest like a lot of green tomatoes, for example, things like that. So preferably, the preference is it be vine ripened, and of course firm and not overripe. But you can ripen your tomatoes inside if it comes to that. So. But not in the refrigerator. It's not going to work in the refrigerator. But there are a lot of really good green tomato recipes out there, whether it be relishes, fried green tomatoes, there's a lot. So I'm going to kind of pick up the pace here because this is like my favorite part. So you had a great year gardening, you want a bigger garden next year. Easy peasy way to do it. If you do it now, then you're going to be great for the spring, ready to go. This lasagna composting, sheet mulching. What you're going to do is compost in place, basically. You're going to layer different types of compostable materials, alternating equal layers. That's where it's different from your compost pile. Instead of that 2-to-1 ratio, now we're going even layers all the way across the board. So equal carbon, equal nitrogen, but we still need the oxygen and the water. So I always think of the carbon as the brown stuff. In this instance, what we're going to start out with is brown cardboard. That's going to be our base layer. The green, the nitrogen, it can be our grass clippings, things like that. But depending on what size bed you're going to make, start assembling your materials in advance. So the best part is you don't have to remove the sod. Cut the grass, or I'm assuming it's going to be grass. Cut it as low as you can. Any weeds, cut them right down as close to the ground as you can. You're going to lay down your layer of cardboard. Remove any tape. If it's cardboard boxes, remove the tape, because otherwise that will come back to visit you again next spring. You'll suddenly see layers of tape. Plus, it's not a good idea. It's not going to compost. But if you don't have any cardboard, 6 layers of newspaper will work just as well. And that's going to smother those weeds in the grass. So you don't have to remove the sod. It's going to break it all down. But remember to overlap it by 6 inches, especially where cardboard boxes, they fold. And you would be amazed at the grass that can sneak up between those little cracks. So I always stagger them and make sure no light can get in there. Water thoroughly, and water as you go along as you're making your layers, but it will benefit you immensely if you water that cardboard first. It's going to make it stay flat while you're working on the rest. So we're going to start out with the nitrogen because we did our first layer in carbon. So technically first layer is going to be nitrogen-rich material. Now if you intend to use manure, and I mentioned this a couple of more times, but manure requires 120 days to wait for harvest time. So with our growing season here in Maine, it doesn't work out when you do the math if you try to add your manure in the spring. So that's another thing to be doing for the fall right now, is adding your manure now. Some other nitrogen-rich materials can be like seaweed, grass clippings, and the kitchen scraps. But that'd be a lot of kitchen scraps, even for like a 3x5 bed. So start stockpiling, I guess, now. I guess is what I'm saying.
Need to be rinsed?
No.
There's no risk of the salt?
No, it does not. And also, if you're harvesting seaweed, only harvest above the tide line. It's the dried, really crunchy stuff in the back. For our carbon, then we're gonna do another layer. We can do our leaves. I recommend running over the leaves with a lawnmower, just because some of them can be so densely packed that they just create a mat. So that's not going to benefit you. But things like peat moss, more newspapers, pine needles, corn stalks, anything rich in carbon, really. So then we go back to I went back. So you keep those alternate layers, greens and browns. Keep watering though. And your top layer is a little different. So your top layer has got to be weed-free carbon. So in other words, we don't want to put like hay. We don't want a weed source. Now there are some seeds in the straw, but if we go with hay, we're introducing not only weed seeds, but those grass seeds that we just started out trying to suppress. But that final layer, that's going to be a little bigger. You can also put a finished compost, like if you had compost from your bin you could add that. Remember though, you can always add more layers later on. It's something you just can keep on with if you feel like it needs more. Also keep in mind, gonna shrink, gonna settle. So when you think you've got this huge amount, maybe it was too much because it's this high, it's gonna shrink really quickly, especially if you watered it properly as it came up. So the more it decomposes, the more it shrinks, and that's a good thing. It's ready to plant, like if you do the fall, that means in the spring, you're gonna be ready to plant in it. You can do seeds or seedlings. Now, if you decide to do this in the spring, you're really only going to be able to do seedlings, and they better be hardy seedlings, because you got to plan on 6 months. So if over the winter it's not going to be doing anything else anyway, now is a great time, to get that started. It'll be ready to go in the spring. Just like with our other compost, when we don't recognize what's in there anymore, we're not looking down and saying, oh look, it's the grass clippings or whatever. It's ready to go, and it's gonna smell like dirt. That's a good way to know. If it still smells like something's decomposing, and it's got that different compost kind of smell, it might need a little more time to break down. So for the rest of our gardens, we want to give them some winter care. We don't want any nutrients leaching out. We don't want erosion going on. The other thing is, we don't want to leave bare soil, because that's just an open invitation for those weeds to come back. So we want to mulch, which helps us add organic matter. We can add the leaves, shredded or whole, but like particularly I find with like my oak leaves and my maple leaves, they get really matted and it's a lot. But you can do things like, to protect your soil, like cardboard. Same thing we did with the lasagna gardening. Cardboard, not only as a weed suppressant, but to protect your soil. You can apply straw, again, not hay, but apply it at least 6 inches, so that it does suppress those weeds and protect the soil. Avoid wood products unless it's in your walkways, because we don't want the wood products to lock up the nitrogen in the soil, where we're looking for the beds next year. If we put wood chips in there, we're actually working against ourselves, because it's going to lock up the nitrogen. It won't be available for the plants. But in the walkways, it's fine. Again, when we apply any type of mulch, whether it be the straw, the lawn clippings, it needs to be thick enough so it's going to suppress those weeds. Again, as I said with the manures, it needs to be applied 20 days prior to harvest. Of course, you know, if you're not familiar with your, you know, your manure source, you know, some things, if you are wondering what kind of questions to ask, you know, are the animals healthy? You know, do they have a parasite problem in the herd? Do you have to keep checking, you know, with that? You know, do they use a lot of antibiotics because of unhealthy animals? Things like that. Before you do any of the amendments, though, test your soil. Find out what it really needs before you go through the trouble and the expense of adding amendments, when you could be all set and then you change it and now you've got to, you know, revert it back. But a good thing to do right now, aside from that, is a cover crop. Late August is perfect to put down a cover crop. Oats are especially good for small gardens, and it'll have plenty of time. It'll get really deep roots. It'll have like a matting root system, so it's going to prevent any soil erosion that, you know, you might be dealing with. And you don't need that much. Like a half a pound will do 100 square feet, so it's easy to apply. It's just a matter of you're just kind of scuffing the soil. You're distributing the seed so it has good soil contact, and just kind of scraping it again. Depending on, you know, you might need to give it a little water, but it's going to have plenty of time to get established, and then we'll have a killing frost, and then it's still is making that dense cover. It's like applying, you know, a thick layer of straw to protect it and to protect your nutrients in there. Now when spring comes, you can work it back into the soil, or you can leave it in there and just like, you know, any no-till gardening, you can just like make a little hole, put your seedling in, and then you've got your mulch all ready to go. So I talked about fall tool care. So you want to make sure that for the working end of your tools, for the tool head, you want to make sure that you're removing all the soil, any other debris on them with a hose first. Just wash them down. Then you can use things like steel wool, a really heavy brush, get all of that off, get any rust off. And then what you can do is actually you can rub down the end of the tool with motor oil, fresh motor oil. You can also, if you have a bucket or a box, you can put the sand in, you can put a little water in, not much, and then you put the motor oil in, and you can just put whatever tool it is, for instance a shovel, and you're just working it in that. It coats the tool so it protects it for the rest of this winter. You can also just store them. If you don't have many tools, just leave them in the bucket that has the motor oil. Check out your wooden handles on any tools, you know, replace any bolts or screws, sand down any splinters, things like that. You can use boiled linseed oil, give it a good coating. It's probably going to take a few applications for it to really soak in. With loppers and hand pruners, they get pretty gunked up, so you can wipe the blades with rubbing alcohol. That's going to dissolve any pitch that's on there, and if you have any rust, you can just use a little bit of steel wool on that. But rinse it again with the rubbing alcohol, wipe it down with a dry cloth. If you want, you can put some oil in the pruning mechanisms, but then they'll be good to go. And you'll thank yourself in the spring when you don't have to go out there and go, oh, I can't even get the pruners open. Before it gets too much later, map your garden, make a sketch, find out what you planted where and how much, because next year when you want to rotate your crops, you're going to be challenged to remember what you had where for a lot of times. Because if you rotate your crops, even in a smaller garden, you can reduce your disease and insect pressure from what you had, if you had any problems. I'm sure no one had any problems this year, but so also on that, you know, make some notes, you know, what did you plant this year that was too much, you know, or you're like, oh, I wish I'd grown more of that, and that worked really good, I want to do that one again. Should you started sooner, started later? These kind of notes. Of course, weather information is always great. Do you wish you'd had more or less space? You know, more space, do the lasagna gardening, create more space. Less space, evaluate, did I really need that much space? You know, did I have 5-foot walkways? You know, could I, do I not want, you know, it was too much, I needed more help, I could not do it. You know, do I want to turn this space into, you know, a fruit patch with like raspberries or something like that, something a little less maintenance heavy. So if you still want to grow stuff and you want to work in the garden some more, there's still plenty to do. If you want to get a jump on spring, there are some seeds that you can sow after several hard frosts. Like for instance, dill and cilantro, calendula, and then some flowers like cosmos, the flowering tobacco and bachelor's buttons. Of course, garlic. We'll talk a little bit about garlic. But bulbs, the rule of thumb is when the daytime temperatures are consistently below 60 degrees, you can go ahead and put your bulbs in, but you don't want them to start sprouting too soon. You don't want them to think it's time to grow now. So, of course, we plant garlic in the fall before the ground freezes, but not too early. Rule of thumb, mid-October for most places. We're going to plant hardneck variety here. Soft neck is usually what we see in the grocery stores. That grows well in California. Do be getting your bulbs, your garlic bulbs from a reputable resource. They have what they call certified, which means that they're certified not to have these issues with like the garlic bloat, nematode. And just keep in mind the largest cloves that you plant are going to give you the largest bulbs, 6 to 12 inches apart. Mulch well. In the spring, we're going to want to come back when we start seeing the green come up and pull that mulch back away from it. So another way to adjust the size of your garden, I just wanted to mention again, is tarping. So this is tarping on a large scale. But say you put a lot of effort into your garden this year, and you know next year you're going to have to work nights as opposed to days, and it's going to change up the time that you have, or say you're planning a big trip. You've really done a lot of work for your garden, and you don't want it to turn back into a weed patch or a lawn. Tarping is an option to maintain this while you manage and decide what it is that, you know, is manageable for you. And we have lots of information on tarping on our website, but it's a good option rather than giving up on all the work that you've already put in. Just like cover crops as well will help maintain that weed suppression and take care of your soil. So you can always redesign and repurpose if things were too much for you. Find out what you liked growing, what you used, what you want to grow next year. So does anyone have any questions for me? Nope. That's okay. That's what I like about this presentation. It's super straightforward. You know, it's you got some experience under your belt. You know, the growing season's on the downside, and it's like, yep. You know, it's a very decisive time of year for me. You know, it's like, yep, I'm never growing that chard again. It was awful. I'm not doing it, you know. But it helps me decide exactly what to do. And it's still fresh in my mind. That's the other good thing, you know. You know, most things are still there, so I can, you know, do that map that I never got to this spring, so that next year I will know exactly what I had in mind. But as always, if you have any questions for me, anytime, you can contact me at lori.bowen@maine.edu. Phone calls are great. I like talking to people on the phone. So anytime you'd like to call me, you can reach me at 942-7396 or 564-3301. So that's all I have for you. But if you have any more questions, please reach out to me, and we'll make a garden plan. Okay. Oh, and if anybody wants soil tests, they're right there.